Hi, and the winner of the poll to see which discussion topic should be on today was whether or not the next expansion is in danger given what we know about Battle for Azeroth. So, in my mind, it is very much in danger, but I remain, not completely negative about it. I don't have a great deal of optimism. There are a couple of areas for optimism, but I'll go over those at the end. So, just to finish on a high note. So, in terms of how these expansions are developed, so what Blizzard have been very clear about, we don't have to guess on this one. They said that Battle for Azeroth began in earnest the day that Legion launched. So Legion launched. Of course, there are some developers that still need to work on Legion. You've got your encounter designers that still need to develop the raids and dungeons to come. And you've got class designers, of course. They're always on the current expansion. That's why, class design is one of the last things to be done in an expansion because they have to wait till the previous one's pretty much done. A few others as well, just to sort things out. But the bulk of the team went over to Battle for Azeroth. So that means the same situation will have been copied across for this one. So the day Battle for Azeroth launched, the bulk of that team, apart from the ones that still have to work on Battle for Azeroth, the bulk of them are now working on earnest on the next expansion, Revenge of the Potato People. So Battle for Azeroth launched, and it wasn't in a complete state. Now, it had about 24 months to be developed. 23 and a half months really if we're counting, but about 24 months. Now if you compare this to the time other expansions have had, it's not bad. I mean, it's not as much as Legion had the most of anyone because that had 2 full expansion cycles to be worked on, or at least 1.5 depending on how you put on it, because Legion was developed in parallel with Warlords of Draenor. So they began both of them when MoP launched, and they weren't sure which order they wanted to bring them out. Well, they knew which order. They wanted to make sure Warlords of Draenor came out to coincide with the Warcraft movie. In the event, by the time they'd made that decision, the Warcraft movie was still supposed to arrive at, then that was delayed. So it ended up not quite working out there. But nonetheless, what it meant was that Legion was still being developed when WoD came out as well. And so it got loads of development time. They were trying to work on quick expansions. That's why they were working on 2 expansions in parallel, which they've not done before and they haven't done since. So Legion got the benefit of that. But compared to other expansions, BFA has actually had a relatively generous amount of time, an extra month or 2 compared to most WoW expansions. So it's very difficult to say they didn't have enough time. The fact that it is unfinished, or it was unfinished when it first came out, I'd still argue it is, was not because they didn't have enough time, I always argue. It's because they didn't work efficiently enough. They didn't properly plan using the resources they had and the time they know they had. That aside, Revenge of the Potato People begins in earnest now. Battle for Azeroth not finished. Now, of the developers that are currently working on Battle for Azeroth, of course, they've got a planned schedule of content to come out over the course of the expansion. But there's a load of stuff not working. They've already spent a considerable amount of time trying to work out how to put fixes in. And they're really trying not to spend too much time on that. You can sort of tell because some of the solutions, although they sort of work to fix a problem, sometimes create other problems as well. Classic case, and I've mentioned this before, is with Azerite Armour. Azerite Armour was pretty much unobtainable from doing Mythic Plus dungeons. You had to be lucky. And I don't just mean lucky to get the one you want. I mean lucky to get any at all. So against this, they then changed to a system with the Residuum, which sort of solved a problem. But the problem is the way they did Residuum, there's any number of ways they could have brought that currency in. The way they chose to do it annoyed quite a lot of raiders because now raiders who are used to in a situation where loot is no longer needed, getting it for transmog, well, there's quite a lot of guilds now saying, actually, this is valuable to us. We're going to give it to so-and-so because they've got rubbish Azerite helm. Well, they can use this, turn it into dust and get a helm with really good stats from the vendor. So, sometimes these things do solve the problem, but then create another problem as well. Because it's not really integrated, it's not been thought through in the way that it really should have been before launch rather than having to make quick decisions. But the point is, there's things that they'd already planned to do for which they've already planned, and there's more things need doing as well because they've got to fix systems, they've got to repair systems. And there's an imperative to do this because They're just telling everyone to calm down, we'll get around to it. Hasn't worked. They've lost a right load of subscribers, which means two things. One, they're up against it now. You know, they may not even have the most active players of any MMO now. That crown could well have been lost. There's a couple of games that, when you think about how many active WoW players we think there are, and you look at the active WoW players that are believed to exist in a couple of other MMOs, it's like, it may not be top anymore. May not be top. So that's obviously worrying for them. Well, I suppose for us as well. And so they've got to fix it. So how do you fix it on top of bringing out that content? You've got a number of options. You could defer content for later on. It's possible that's happened, because I would say patch 8.1 didn't have a massive amount of content in it. I don't know that more content was planned, though. It may have been as expected. It wasn't, it wasn't terrible. We obviously had a couple of new raids, but you'd expect that anyway. Remember, the raids are the encounter design team. They would be expected anyway. So their work isn't an issue. We're talking about work on other systems in the game for which the developers who would have worked on it, a lot of them are over on Revenge of the Potato People. So you could defer some content potentially. It's probably not ideal to do that. They are, not only do they promise, and they've promised this since WOD, to bring out a good amount of content each patch, they've recently promised as well that there's a lot more to come. They kept pointing to Legion. They said, remember in Legion, there was lots more to come at this point, and there's going to be the same for BFA. Of course, I would also argue that at this point there was also a lot more in Legion, but not going to pull that one. So that's one thing you could do, you could defer it. The other thing is you could just straight up cancel content. That's not ideal, although I'm sure they won't cancel content they've already announced. They could, in theory, cancel some content that they hadn't announced yet, and they might get away with it. The problem with that is, if at the end of the expansion it still felt a bit light on content, and people are inevitably going to draw comparisons with Legion, which I don't really think is comparing like for like, but people are inevitably going to do it. So that could be tricky. The other thing is you pull developers. Well, you could, I suppose, get the developers you have to work longer hours. That's not realistic. They already work plenty. So you have to pull developers off Revenge of the Potato People. And you may just pull them off with an intended, like, for 3 months, something like that, which could also have an effect on the next expansion. But also remember, these are people who did not adequately understand the time they had anyway. They didn't really plan the expansion for the time frame and resources they had. So if they pull them off for 3 months to get things sorted, who's to say it would only take 3 months? How do we believe that they're any better at judging that time now than they were then? Maybe they've learnt, who knows, but do they look like they're learning? Now, if they have pulled any developers off for any amount of time, that obviously has a knock-on effect on the next expansion, because it's now going to have fewer resources than even BFA had, because BFA didn't have to have people emergency pulled for Legion. So now the next expansion already has a little bit less development time, potentially. Then there's been the spectre of budget cuts. So WoW, for the first time, WoW has never had a budget cut. Other aspects of the Blizzard games have, but World of Warcraft hasn't, because why would it? It's a big money spinner. Now budget cuts have been mentioned. Whether in response to the disappointing performance of BFA or just generally, I don't know. But reliable sources from within Blizzard have, well, people believe, shall we say, that it is true. So in what form those budget cuts take, I can only imagine developers being pulled off for other projects and not replaced. So the development team presumably is getting smaller. Whether that's already happened or whether that is to happen, I couldn't say. If it's already happened, then obviously that has a knock-on effect on the next expansion as compared to Battle for Azeroth. So you'd have a situation where the next expansion is presumably going to have 2 years as well to be developed, just like the other one was. They can't give it any more than that. Remember, they've staked their reputation on no more content droughts. You know, the time between the last bit of content for Legion, the proper content that is, and the next on the pre-expansion patch coming out was okay. That was decent for Legion. No issues with that for me. But if it's significantly more than that, then there would be. And so I don't think they can just afford to go longer and spend more on it. But apart from anything else, that would be effectively increasing the budget for it, because that would be longer before Blizzard could recoup the costs by selling off the pre-orders. And they're not going to make as much money from the pre-orders in the next expansion as they did BFA, because there aren't as many players to want to buy it. Unless they're going to hope that basically all of those other players will come back all hyped up for the next expansion. I've no doubt they will pull their next trick on that one, by the way. They will bring something out that will get you to want to pre-order. Just like with BFA, they said, oh, allied races. They come out when BFA comes out, but do you know what? If you pre-order it now, months ahead of time, we'll let you use them now. I am certain they will pull something like that again, not necessarily with allied races, but with something else. But how many people it will fool this time, I couldn't say. So the next expansion, it's looking ropey from that point of view. I just think budget cut compared with the fact that BFA needs fixing. And here's the other thing as well. It's not even a case of if they pull people from BFA or not. Even if they don't, you could argue, well, actually, the next expansion will at least get as much as BFA. But there are still two other issues. One is that the people in charge are largely still the people in charge of BFA. Now, those people in charge couldn't manage to bring out the BFA expansion in that time. Who believes they're going to bring out Revenge of the Potato People in a finished state in that same time? Unless they've learnt. And as I say, I don't believe they're learning. But then there's the other thing. So, like I say, some developers always stay on the active live one. Class designers, encounter designers, that sort of thing. And there's a few others as well. And then the bulk of them go over to the old one. It's the next one, sorry. But then you've got your senior developers, the ones who are in charge of teams. They have to have a foot in both camps. But with the live version struggling, doesn't it make sense to suppose that those senior developers are having to pay rather more attention on the live one than would normally be expected? Does that mean that I already think that BFA, one of the chief problems with, in fact, World of Warcraft recently, is that there's some quite brilliant developers working on it, but they're not working in a coordinated way because leadership is poor, coordination is poor. If you don't have any leadership on the next expansion at the moment because too much focus is on BFA, then that means that level of coordination is even less than it was for BFA. That is going to mean much less efficient working, much more problems. And when the senior managers do start to pay more attention to it, they'll suddenly start throwing things out, putting it on the development team that might be wasting a load of their work just as they did for BFA. So that's another issue. So are there any rays of hope in all this? Can I see any little rays of hope? So the way I analyse it is this. We've basically got the same people running the show. I see no evidence that they're learning. So that doesn't fill me with confidence. Budget cuts, that can't fill you with confidence. The current live expansion is in serious need of not just the work needing done to what that was already planned, but extra work that wasn't planned at all. That at the very least has to mean that the leadership is not focusing as much on the next expansion right now as it should be. All of those things put it in a pretty bad shape. However, there were a number of major technological advances with Battle for Azeroth that Blizzard were trying to get into the game. If we can assume that a lot of the time lost, if we want to call it that, was down to those issues, which will be then much more stable for the next one, it is possible that they will be able to work to that time frame and bring out an expansion that is finished, or is finished as you can expect an expansion to be when it launches, for the next one. That is basically my only ray of hope. My only ray of hope is that they can focus, if they can focus entirely on content and don't have to worry about coming up with platforms for this new technology that's been put into the game, in a situation like that, we may have some hope. But that is still ranked against the three things that, for me, mean I don't think it's credible to suppose that the next expansion will be better than BFA. If you enjoy BFA, then I'm not saying that you're in for a bad time for the next one. I'm not saying I think the next expansion will be worse than BFA. But what I cannot credibly believe is that it would be better. I think it is likely to be not quite as good because of the things I mentioned. That doesn't mean to say that it won't be still good for a lot of people. But I would say if you're thinking to yourself, as I am, I'm afraid to say, if you're thinking to yourself, right, we'll give this story a go, we'll give this expansion a go, and then we'll see what it's like in the next expansion, but it'll have to improve for me. If you're like that, and I'm not like that, it just has to stay the same for me, it just not has to get worse. But if you are like that, I think Blizzard's going to lose more players, because I don't see any reason to provide any optimism that it would be better. At best, about the same, and may be completed in a finished state at least. But even that's a stretch. That is a stretch. That has to assume that all these creative developers were spending massive amounts of time on the technological improvements, not actually working on them, obviously then, not techs, but in trying to integrate it into the game and considering the possibilities, whereas it'll be more familiar to them then. So anyway, so that's what I think about the next expansion. It's not a very positive outlook, I'm afraid. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And also, if you click the bell notification, you'll be notified of the polls that go out for the next discussion video, for which there will be one up as you are watching this. So check on that out and vote on the next discussion topic as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.